everybody and welcome back to my studio, the Pottery Corner down on the south coast of England near Chichester. And today I thought I would answer some questions about kilns, because I know that a lot of you hobby potter people want to think about buying your own kiln and making the investment as you get through your work and find that you have nowhere to fire it. So first thing to say is that if you are a local person to me or Chichester on the south coast of England, then I do hire out my kilns. So if you need to fire your work and you're local, please get in touch via the website, which is www.thepotterycorner.co.uk, and you'll find on there the kiln services. But if you're thinking of investing in a kiln, I thought that I would just give you a little "this is my journey" type video, just so that it gives you some information. So when I first started, I didn't have anywhere to fire my work, so I was going to adult education classes and using the kilns that were available via that service. But I found very quickly that unfortunately, because of the amount of work, the amount of students and the amount of work that was going through the kilns, that a lot of my pieces were damaged before they got to the firing in the greenware stage. So things would be broken off, or they'd get broken off in the kiln. So it just, you know, you spend a lot of time, as you know, making these things, so it just didn't work. So I had to invest in my own kiln. So at that stage, I invested in Mungo, who is my larger kiln. Now Mungo is a Rohde, and he is a 75 litre internal capacity. So he's quite a large kiln. He's not one of the massive kilns that has to have the special three-phase wiring. He is single phase, however, because he pulls nearly 4 kilowatts of power, he does have his own kiln supply. So this kiln supply has been wired from our house, because the studio is in a separate building. From the house, we have an armoured cable that comes all the way out to the outbuilding, and then comes in as a dedicated kiln supply. And we also had the fuse, the house fuse. So the main house fuse on a normal domestic supply is 60 amps. And because we have the kiln, we asked the electric company to increase the size of the household fuse to 100 amps, so that we don't have problems if we're using the kiln and, you know, you're using cookers and computers and all the rest of it that go on in your daily life. So we have had that increased, and they will do that free of charge. So they didn't charge us for that. They just increased the fuse in the box to 100 amps. Now, we also have solar power here, so I always say to the students that the kiln will go on the next sunny day, because the solar power will actually almost, not completely, but will almost fire the kilns using renewable energy. And obviously, in this day and age, we do need to be thinking about how much power we're using to fire these kilns. So I am careful that I as much as possible will fire the kilns on a sunny day, and I can look at the weather forecast forthcoming to see when the sunny days are going to be. So in the winter, obviously that's more difficult and it doesn't always work, but in the summer, definitely the kilns are almost completely solar powered. And interesting, I noticed that John Smith, John the Potter, has put a video up this week or last week with the solar powers that he's just had put in, panels that he's just had put in on his house. So the similar thing, I've actually been doing that for several years now. So Mungo, as I say, he's a Rohde, 75 litre, has his own kiln supply, and this is a dedicated supply that comes from the house, and we upped the ampage of the house fuse to take the load that Mungo will pull. And in terms of internal diameter, I thought that I would just quickly give you some idea of what the firing space is inside these kilns, because I mean, obviously you have a depth of insulating brick round the inside of the kiln. So I can make pieces that are almost as long as this ruler. Now this is, if I do it from the right end, I can tell you what that is in centimetres. So taking it right up to the lid, it's 42 centimetres inside. So when I'm making a piece, I always have to be aware of what my internal space is. So height-wise, it's 42 centimetres. And then the kiln shelves that we use in Mungo are this size. So again, that is probably 41.5 centimetres diameter. Now you do have a little bit of leeway around the kiln shelf because there's probably 2 centimetres either side of the shelf when it actually goes into the kiln. But that's your kiln shelf. So if you're making platters and all those lovely flat things that my students like to make, if you watch my videos you'll know what I mean. We do have to be aware of how big the diameter of the kiln is, and upstairs on some of the workboards, the wooden workboards, I actually have the diameter, the circle of the kiln shelf on those boards so that the students know how big they can go for a kiln shelf. So that is Mungo. Now I have repaired this kiln and replaced the kiln elements not long ago, and I keep a kiln log. So this is just for my information, but also it's quite useful to know how much you're using your kiln. I mean, obviously with the students here, we are using the kilns quite often, and therefore I like to keep a log of what programmes they've done, whether they've done a bisque firing or a glaze firing or indeed a lustre firing. So I keep a kiln log and I write the date and the programme that was done. And talking about programmes, you'll see on the wall here that this is a Rohde programmer, which is Mungo's programmer, and you can program 10 different kiln firings on your programmer, and it's so simple. Actually, I use 2, a biscuit firing and a glaze firing, and then I know what number the program is. I come in, I put the number on there, press the button, and the kiln programmer does everything else for me. So if you're a hobby potter, much the best way to go. Now Midge, who is the smaller kiln, he is simply what they call a plug and go. So he has a normal electrical supply socket and plug, the same as you'd use in your house. So he just plugs into the normal 13 amp plug and go. So he doesn't need any special firing because he's a smaller kiln and he's not pulling as much power. So he pulls about 2 kilowatts of power, and obviously Mungo being bigger, he pulls 4 kilowatts of power. So there's a big difference between the two. Now Midge also has a programmer. His is a Stafford programmer. You know, it doesn't really make any difference which programmer you have. They work very similarly, and I have the same numbers programmed into the Stafford programmer as I do the Rohde programmer, so I don't get confused about which program I'm using. So basically it's program 1 and 2, program 1 for bisque, program 2 for glaze, and then I have program 10 on Midge for the lustre firing, which if you've watched my other videos you'll see that there is a lustre firing video where I explain the temperatures for lustre firing. Pardon me. So Midge is obviously a much smaller kiln, and if we look at the kiln shelf that we were looking just a moment ago for Mungo, the kiln shelf for Midge is this size. So if I put the one on top of the other, you can see how much smaller the internal dimensions of Midge are. So that it's a much smaller kiln. In some ways better for a hobbyist, because obviously you're not waiting to create mountains of work to be able to fire your kiln. So the diameter of that kiln shelf is 32 centimetres, so much smaller. And then the internal chamber dimension is 31 centimetres max, top max. So obviously it's a lot smaller, so therefore the size of the pieces that you can make to go into that kiln will obviously be smaller. And as I say, I use it generally if I want to get some biscuit work through quicker than waiting for a large biscuit load to go into Mungo. Now obviously if you're using a Rohde kiln like these, this is particularly simple for a hobbyist because you don't need any special wiring. You do have to make sure that the room that you're using your kiln in is well ventilated, because you do get fumes when the kilns are firing. Obviously you get more fumes on a glazed fire than on a biscuit fire, but you do need to make sure that your room is well ventilated. And also you need to make sure you have enough room around your kiln. I mean, you'll see that this is set a good 18 inches away from the wall, and a good, 18 inches, well, probably 2 foot, 24 inches away from the table. So I am careful that I make sure that there's enough room around the kiln for the air to circulate. Now, the kilns run without a bung. So this is a spy hole bung, okay, and that goes into the side of the kiln. I'm not sure if you can see that, but there's an aperture in the side of the kiln, and I don't put the bung into my kiln until the kiln temperature has reached 700 degrees C. And when it reaches 700 degrees centigrade, then I pop the bung in for the remainder of the programme. So a bisque fire programme would go to 1000 degrees centigrade, and a blaze fire programme will go to 1230 degrees C. So on that basis, I tend to try and do glaze firing in my larger kiln, because it is not putting quite as much strain on the smaller kiln. The kiln is able to go, Midge, the smaller kiln, is able to go to 1300 degrees centigrade. So it's not that he can't do it, it's just that obviously he's using more pull, and he will be using more sort of pull from his elements. So he's going to run out of element life quicker if he goes to the higher temperature. So I do tend to try and use the smaller kiln just for biscuit firing and for lustre firings, because obviously they only go up to 800 degrees. So I hope that's helpful. Where do you buy a kiln? Now that's an interesting question. Obviously there are lots of second-hand kilns around. There are lots of places to look for second-hand kilns. eBay, some of the Facebook pages for pottery for sale, etc. Be careful, be careful. If you buy a very old kiln and it doesn't have a programmer, you are going to be making a rod for your own back, because some kilns still have what's called a kiln sitter, and they are difficult to use, difficult to control temperature-wise, and basically they're just a pain. Make your life easy, spend a little bit more on getting a decent kiln. Now obviously I have Rohde kilns, I'm a little bit biased on Rohde, they're German, you know what the Germans are like, they make very good quality products, and I haven't had any trouble with my kilns at all, apart from having to replace the elements. Now obviously that is a comestible that you're going to need to have in your kiln if you use it for the studio work like I use it for. So obviously that's sort of like an item that I know needs to be replaced on a sort of a not regular basis. I think they probably last for about 3 years or thereabouts. So, but nonetheless you do need to bear in mind that you are at some stage going to have to replace your elements. And that's another reason for not buying a second-hand kiln that you don't know. You don't know how many times that's been fired. You don't know if it gets to the temperature that they say that it gets to. There's no way that you can test it. So do be careful if you're thinking about buying a second-hand kiln. Sometimes, they're cheap for a reason. So keep your eye out for a decent brand. I mean, you could buy a Scut. There's lots of different makes that you can buy, that just make sure that you're not buying something that you don't know how to work and is difficult to work. If it doesn't have a programmer on, then it's likely to be a very old kiln, and therefore it's unlikely to get up to the temperatures that you want to get to for stoneware firing. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Just a little bit of sort of background. Do please ask me any questions that you have in the comments below, and I'll be happy to answer them if I'm able. There's, you know, bits and pieces going on here. No courses at the moment, obviously, with the COVID-19 restrictions. So we're hoping to come back in January with courses, but at the moment, you know, the UK is suffering quite badly with coronavirus, and I know it's bad in other places. So wherever you are, I do hope that you're able to stay safe and well. And do subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you're viewing from, and I'll see you all on the next video. Bye for now.